Tonight we are welcoming Stephanie Gardner, who's going to tell us about her historical fiction book, Rattlesnake Granny, Nancy Remembers Life in Old Thornton Gap. And I'm particularly intrigued by the prospect of these stories from the 19th century and about our John Wayland, who's from Shenandoah County, and how his connection with those stories. That was something in particular that intrigued me. Stephanie has family roots in Southwest Virginia, though she grew up in the mountains of western North Carolina, and she now lives in the valley, so she really hasn't gone very far. She has degrees in history, public history, and library science, and she works as a librarian, an archivist, and a museum curator. She is the special collections director, I believe, at Bridgewater College. So, Stephanie.
Thank you. Slide around back here. And I have a very quiet voice, but I'm going to try to speak loudly tonight. So you may want to move up if you can't hear me. But I had always wanted to write a book. And I never wrote one until now because I couldn't think of anything that was new that nobody else had wrote about. And also because I couldn't find anything that would hold my interest long enough to write about, even a short book like this. But then one day at Bridgewater College, I was working with the day books and papers of historian Dr. John Wayland. And I'm sure everybody here knows of Dr. John Wayland. He lived from 1872 to 1962. And a very good Virginia historian, an educator, and an author. But he would write down pretty much everything that he did every day in these day books that he kept. But he would write about the historical work he was doing, about his family life, even about the weather. So I read that in 1932, John Wayland went to Luray, and there he met with the marble sculptor Herbert Barbee. And he told Herbert Barbee and him went to Thornton Gap, Virginia, which is at the border of Page and Rappahannock counties. Herbert Barbee had grown up there, and he told John Wayland about some of the people who he remembered growing up in Thornton Gap around the time of the Civil War. Herbert Barbee lived from 1848 to 1936. So he was a teenager, a young teenager, a tween, around the time of the Civil War. And one of the people who he told John Wayland about was a woman named Nancy Pullum. And I found this person's story so interesting that I was very eager to write about her. I don't think that John Wayland published about her. Maybe he did somewhere in a newspaper article, but I haven't seen her recorded in any of his books. Herbert Barbee told John Wayland that this woman, Nancy Pullum, lived on the mountainside by herself, and she made her living catching rattlesnakes. She would catch the rattlesnakes in a loop, he said, and then she would hang them up, and she thought they would bite themselves on purpose when they knew that they were caught, because they were, I guess, out of spitefulness. So she would hang them up by their heads, although in the book I have her hanging them up by their tails. And then she would eventually, when they stopped wiggling, make this topical medicine to treat arthritis out of the snake oil. So these bottles are about the size of the bottles that I imagine that she was selling her snake oil in. Herbert Barbee described Nancy Pullum to John Wayland as being a very unattractive woman, which wasn't very nice. He said she was really rough looking, but he said that she had a heart of gold. And another person Well, actually, let me tell you a little bit about the snakes first. So we have two venomous snakes in our area. And do you all know what our two venomous snakes are?
Copperhead.
Yeah. Copperhead and the rattlesnake, yeah. So which one is more common in the area? Yeah, down where I live too. There are some rattlesnakes, but the copperhead is much more common. And which one is more deadly? Just the rattlesnake, yeah. Copperhead bite is a medical emergency, but a rattlesnake bite can be quite deadly, and it's a true emergency. In the book, and I won't give any spoilers, but somebody gets bitten, and the person's okay. And I imply that that is what's called a dry bite. That's when a venomous snake bites someone and it doesn't give out its full store of venom, or maybe not any venom at all. It's been estimated that about 25 to 50% of venomous snake bites are dry bites. One of the questions that I get a lot is, would Nancy Pullum snake oil work to treat arthritis as a topical ointment? I did some reading on it, and rattlesnake oil would contain some antioxidants, so it would probably work okay, or omega-3 fatty acids. So it might work okay as a topical ointment. There's a Chinese snake that's used in Chinese medicine, a water snake that has a lot of omega-3 fatty acids. And that Chinese water snake might be very effective at treating inflammation. Later on in American history, as you all know, people began to sell what they said was rattlesnake oil, and it didn't really have any rattlesnake oil in it. Those people were charlatans, and the federal government prosecuted them under what was some of the first regulation of medicine in the USA. Another person who Herbert Barbee told John Whalen about on that 1932 visit to Thornton Gap, who Herbert Barbee remembered growing up, was a man who was a former slave or an enslaved person, as many historians would say today. And in the primary sources, this man is named Uncle Bob, or called Uncle Bob. I didn't want to call him that. That didn't seem nice, so I called him in the book John. And this man was a slave of, or enslaved by, Herbert Barbee's grandfather, Andrew Russell Barbee. The Barbees had a lot going on in Thornton Gap. They ran a hotel. They worked on the roads. They ran a post office, a pottery at one time, and they were major enslavers in the area. This man, he was growing quite old by the time Herbert Barbee knew him, and he was very infirm with arthritis. Herbert Barbee told John Whalen he walked everywhere with 2 canes, and you could see the tracks where he had been walking with his 2 canes. This man, he asked Herbert Barbee's grandfather to give him his freedom and give him some land up on the mountainside. Herbert Barbee's grandfather, Andrew Russell Barbee, said no. But he told this man he wouldn't be able to survive up on the mountainside by himself. But this man kept persisting, and eventually Andrew Russell Barbee did set him free and gave him some land up on the side of the mountain. I don't know if it was a formal official emancipation. It is in the book, but he was recorded up there as living next to Nancy Pullum. And Herbert Barbee told John Whalen that this man did really well at gardening, and he was able to sustain himself. In the book, I take it a little farther and have him growing fruits and vegetables as a truck garden. But John Whalen remembered seeing some fruit trees that this man, who the character called John, planted. So I have some heirloom corn to represent him, and some of the things we can pass around. So you're welcome to pass around the heirloom corn. Thank you. Another person who Herbert Barbee told John Whalen about in that 1932 visit to Thornton Gap was Herbert Barbee's father, William Randolph Barbee. Has anyone heard of William Randolph Barbee? He was a sculptor. He was a marble sculptor. So he grew up in Thornton Gap with a lot of brothers and sisters in the Hosberg house. And ever since he was a boy, he was always sculpting. And they used the word feeble-minded then, which wasn't nice, but they said people thought he was feeble-minded because it seemed like all he cared about was sculpting and carving, whittling. But eventually, they found out that he had real talent. And he did go to art school for a little while, but he went to college to be an attorney. And he didn't want to be an attorney and practice law as a career. He wanted to practice law to make money. So when he had made enough money, he and his wife, Mary Jane Barbee, and their two boys, Clifford and Herbert, went to Italy. And there, William Randolph Barbee learned about stone carving. So I have a carver's antique stone carving chisel here to represent him. We can pass around. The way that, they were neighbors, but one of the ways that Herbert Barbee remembered Nancy Pullum is he said that she would come and smoke at their stone house, the Bower House. And this is reflected in the book, pretty close to the way it is in the primary source, that she would come to the Bower and yell, "Get down here, William, I'm come to smoke with you." He was probably carving upstairs, and he would come down and sit with her, and they would talk. So John Whalen found that was very interesting, this mountaineer woman talking with this marble carving sculptor. So I've got a pipe here. We recently looked at the pipe, and I think my father found that it was made in Italy. And it's probably not as old as Civil War times, but it's something fun to pass around. William Randolph Barbee, with his marble sculpting, he became quite accomplished. And I heard incidentally that the local people did not always like it because his carvings were often of nude women. So there was a family story that Herbert Barbee told John Whalen that I didn't put in the book. But the story is that when one of the most famous statues was on display, the statue was named the Coquette, and she was touring. And John Whalen imagined that it was probably touring around Washington, D.C., and William Randolph Barbee's mother and father, his father Andrew Russell, and his mother, who also was named Nancy, traveled to see the Coquette on display. And when they got to where it was showing, Mrs. Barbee, William Randolph Barbee's mother, turned to her husband and said, "Pa, this is not the kind of thing for us." And he said, "Well, what do you mean? This is the famous Coquette that our son has carved that's getting national acclaim." And she said, "William, you get over here." And he did. And he said, "Yes, Mama?" And she said, "Why don't you put more clothes on that statue?" But anyway, William Randolph Barbee, he eventually went to the U.S. Capitol building where he had a studio. And he was doing some government work, but then during the Civil War, he had to flee the Capitol building. And when he left, his supposed-to-be helper took his tools, he stole his works of art, and they got scattered all around. It took them years to find them. And so things were kind of hard for the family after that. William Randolph Barbee, he also got sick, and they went back to Thornton Gap and were living in that Bower house, the stone house that was built in the 1700s by the Skinner family. So let's see. The story is told in dialect, And the dialect is largely the way that my family spoke in southwestern Virginia, so probably Scots-Irish dialect. And the story just takes place in a little bit of Thornton Gap. But I don't know if you all are familiar with this book, Shenandoah Secrets. It tells about Thornton Gap, and it reproduces a map that John Whalen had drawn when he visited Herbert Barbie in Thornton Gap. And John Whalen published the map in Historic Homes of Northern Virginia and the Eastern Panhandle of West Virginia. And this shows the area where these historic people lived. And you can see Nancy Pullum's cabin, the man who they called Uncle John, his cabin, the big Hosburg house, where William Randolph Barbie grew up. And you can see the tannery that the Barbie family owned and the bower where William Randolph Barbie and his family were living. So you can pass that around. Thank you. One of the things that I wanted to talk about in the book is the Civil War. And there was a lot of troop movement up and down Thornton Gap during the Civil War. Also talked about Mary's Rock, which is the highest point in Thornton Gap area. William Randolph Barbie told his wife, Mary Jane Barbie, that he named Mary's Rock for her. And he told his children that too, but apparently it was really named for Mary Thornton, who had settled the area much earlier. And somebody was telling me a story about when they dug the tunnel through Mary's Rock, they hit a big nest of rattlesnakes. So I guess they're still up in that area. Another thing I wanted to talk about in the book is the Anabaptist faith in the valley. Of all the characters, I know the most about the Barbie family, B-A-R-B-E-E, from written records. I don't really know anything about Nancy Pullum or the John character other than what Herbert Barbie told John Whalen and he recorded. But I thought it would be fun to make, in the book, Nancy's father a member of the Church of the Brethren, or the Dunkards. And to represent the historic Dunkards, or the historic Church of the Brethren, I have this bonnet. And this is like a woman would have worn, maybe around the time of the Civil War, a Brethren woman, and it would be plain dress or plain clothing to show that she was not concerned with fashion. She was not concerned with worldly things, but she wanted to dress very moderately and be a separatist from the world. This is a reproduction that I ordered from the website Etsy that somebody made. She wasn't reproducing a Brethren bonnet. The Brethren bonnets that I've seen at the time, they're slat bonnets. So they have slats like window shades in them. And one thing I learned quite recently is that the slats could be removed. I didn't know that. So we can pass around the bonnet. Another thing that I talk a little bit about in the book is that the Brethren were and are a peace church. So many of the Brethren in the area were separatist, or they were, some were even unionist. And in the book, Nancy Pullum reflects on the death of Elder John Klein, who was the Brethren martyr who was killed near Broadway during the Civil War by Confederate irregulars. And I wanted to talk about hymn singing, the great tradition of hymn singing in the valley. So at one point, Nancy says that her father liked to sing from his Little David songbook. And my German is horrible, but that would be the Klein Davidisch Psalterspiel, or Kinder Zion, the Little David songbook for the children of Zion. And that's a hymn book that we see frequently in special collections from this area. There was a school in Thornton Gap, and in the book I have Nancy Pullum going to school. And she writes that they had books in English and German, because as we know, a lot of printers in the valley. This was a book that was printed in English. It's Sturm's Reflections on the Season. And it was printed in Mountain Valley in 1848. So what do we call Mountain Valley today? Yeah, Singer's Glen. So this is printed in Singer's Glen by Joseph Funk and Sons. And I really like this book because it's like a very early devotional. Not written in the U.S., it's a translation. But the author reflects on how God is reflected throughout the seasons and through nature. And there's a reading for each day. And it was a very beautiful book at one point. It has this marbled in paper. This is probably sheepskin cover. And I've heard that once sheepskin starts to peel, there's really not much that you can do for it. But this is something you can pass around. The cover is coming off, so I realized that. I also wanted to talk about folklore and folk magic in the book, and both Scots-Irish and Pennsylvania German folklore. So one of the things that the characters mention is a fire letter. Has anyone heard of those? Those are a broadside, a piece of printed material, and not very originally named, because they call it the broadside because one side is broader of the paper. But a fire letter is a Pennsylvania German tradition, and they were printed here in the valley as well. The idea is that it's a blessing for your home that you can paste up to prevent fire. So it's a prayer, but it's also kind of a magic charm. And there's a fire letter in special collections that I work with, the Pennsylvania State Library, Penn State, has it digitized as part of their Pennsylvania German broadside collection online. Another type of broadside that's mentioned in the book is a house blessing. And this is the same idea. It's a prayer you can hang up, and it invokes God and asks to keep the house safe. But as well as being a prayer, it's kind of a magic charm too. And in the book, somebody does blood stopping. Somebody gets hurt and somebody else stops the blood using the blood verse. And that's Ezekiel 16:6. So I learned about this. I had read about this tradition in some books, but also my uncle does this. And the last time he did it, my aunt had cut her leg on a table at a restaurant, and he said the blood verse, and her leg stopped bleeding. And some people were very interested in what he was doing. Other people were pretty turned off by it, I think. So, and there's another type of medicine that's practiced in the book that I wrote, and it's Thompsonian medicine. Elder John Klein was a Thompsonian doctor. He would have been buying medicine by subscription or purchasing medicine from a commercial college. And Thompsonian medicine, it's an alternative form of medicine. So often, when I started the presentation, sometimes I would ask people, do you think that the college-trained physicians liked this alternative frontier medicine? And people would say no. And somebody said, well, I don't think they like it now. They don't like alternative medicine now either. But let's see. I also told some ghost stories in the book, because that's another tradition of the area. And another person I haven't talked about yet was William Randolph Barbie's wife, Herbert Barbie's mother. Her name was Mary Jane McKay Barbie, and I have a mirror to represent her. She grew up in Luray, and her father was a civil engineer. I wonder if maybe she met William Randolph Barbie because their fathers worked on the road together through Thornton Gap. I have the mirror to represent her because she was a town lady. And I don't know what it was like, what her transition was really like, going from Luray to living in the stone bower house in Thornton Gap. But in the book, I like to imagine that it was quite a transition, going from town life to a country life. Somebody told me very recently that there's a sketch of her at the Luray Caverns Museum, and that she looks like quite the Southern belle. So I really want to go see this sketch. Has anybody seen it? Okay. They said that they're contrasting her with some of the mountaineer women as they're depicted. And her sisters, some of her sisters are in the book, and they're based on real people. Also, the children are based on real people. And the house where they lived, the Bower House, was stone, and it also had some slave quarters. There's a video on YouTube of a man who bushwhacks to the Bower. The Bower is now, the remains of the Bower are now in Shenandoah National Park. So it was off the trail, but it was very interesting what he found. He found some remains of it. I think he may have found evidence it was burned, which was the case. The Park Service had recorded it was burned. I don't know if that was part of the eviction of the last residents who lived there when they built the park, or if that was earlier, like during the Civil War. There's some other characters in the book. There's a granny woman, midwife and healer, who's a fictional character. And there's also a Native American fictional character who's also an herbalist. So I have this wooden projectile point or arrowhead to represent her. The Native American people in our area, they had left when the European settlers came in. I actually heard recently that they had left before the European settlers came in. I don't know if that's true, but I thought that was quite interesting. But the local Native American people are the Monacan culture, and they live in Bear Mountain now in Amherst County. So I wanted to represent them. One thing that I wanted to show with the book is that as much as I admire these earlier historians like John Whalen and C.E. May, they were often saying that this area that's now Shenandoah National Park was very culturally homogenous, that it was all Scots-Irish people. And if you're looking at Thornton Gap, you can see that that's not true, because the Barbie family were of French descent. This character, John, was of African descent. And historic Nancy Pullum, she is probably of Scots-Irish descent. Another theme that I wanted to show, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, is that the people weren't quite as isolated as earlier historians and later propaganda portrayed. But I'll talk a little bit about nature in the book. So we have bears, and we still live with bears. Has everybody seen a bear in the wild? So yeah, so our black bears are not as dangerous as, of course, grizzly bears or polar bears, but you've still got to be careful around the black bears. There's a website called BearWise that's very good, that tells very good tips about living with bears. One thing is that it's a crime to feed a bear, even by accident. So if a bear keeps coming to your bird feeder, it's illegal. And I was very surprised to see how many calories birdseed has in it. And no wonder bears go there getting all those calories. I also wanted to talk a little bit about owls in the book. And there's a lot of great folklore about owls. This is a book called What an Owl Knows by Jennifer Ackerman. That's a very good source for learning about owls. There's an owl in the book, probably a great horned owl. This is not a great horned owl on the cover. But an interesting fact that I learned about owls, and we can pass this around, is that their ears don't age like human ears. They can hear well all their life, and they have to fly very silently to catch their prey. And the great horned owls are the tigers of the skies. They're the tigers of the skies. And their call can be heard from a long distance, especially if the atmosphere is right for it. I also talk some about the eastern cougar in the book, or as Nancy Pullum calls it, painters. And those were eradicated from our area, sadly. There's a lot of folklore about them still being in our area. But there may have been a few around during the Civil War time. And then I talked about crows. And this crow, it can do a trick. Let's see if we'll do a trick. There it is. So that's a real crow call. Crows are very smart. I told a story in the book, It's Happening to Nancy, that really happened to me. When I was a camp counselor, I was walking along a trail by myself, and it wasn't deep woodland, but it felt like deep woodland, because I was all by myself. And then these crows came and settled in the trees around me, and they started making all these sounds. And I knew that they were picking on me. And they were making sounds like babies crying and bobbing up and down. So I tell that story in the book. Also, cicadas are mentioned, although they're called by the old mountain name locusts. And I talk some about animal husbandry. Fictional Nancy Pullum has a hog, and a drover comes in and takes the livestock out by the Great Road. She also lets her hog forage in the woods, as would have been the custom or the tradition. And then she also moves her animals to higher pasture land, because the land would have been used up near where she lived, and the grass was greener near the top of the mountain. I learned a lot about how the historic mountain people used the land by this book, The Appalachian Forest by Chris Bolgiano. An excellent book. She's a really great author, and I was very fortunate to meet with her and talk with her as I wrote my book. So I recommend this book. She's also wrote about mountain lions, and has a good book about them. And of course I wanted to have a cat based on my cat Rainey, a house cat. I also wanted to talk about the local pottery tradition in the valley. I had a pot that I would show, which was a replica, and it disappeared during my last talk. So hopefully I just left it behind and nobody stole it, but that was sad. If somebody thought it was a historic pot, it was be an unhappy surprise for them, because it's not. It's a modern replica made by Michael Howe. Yeah, so there we go. And in the 1920s and 1930s, they started propaganda to move the people out of this area where these historical people lived. Some of the propaganda some of it was photography. One of the things that happened was Mandel Sherman and Thomas Henry published this 1933 book, Hollow Folk. This is probably about the worst bound book ever because the covers fell off, but it portrays the Hollow people in a very negative light, and now it's considered propaganda, saying that it would be better for these people to move them to civilization. So we can pass this around. And archaeology is showing that even in, I guess you could say, the deepest hollows, that these people were not totally isolated from civilization. Later on, they were finding store-bought goods and printed materials and things, and even these remote areas. And I think it's really neat how modern archaeology is proving that. So I'm working on a sequel, and want to talk more about some of the industry in the area during the sequel. And let's see if there's anything here that I haven't talked about yet. Oh yeah, William Randolph Barbie, he had several brothers. One of the brothers had a connection to Bridgewater, where I live. Does anybody know what it is? The restaurant that is now the Cracked Pillar Pub was owned by William Randolph Barbie's brother, Colonel Gabriel Barbie. And he also did some agricultural organizing in the area. But I don't talk about that in my first book, but I do talk about William Randolph Barbee's brother, Andrew Barbee Jr. And he was a Civil War soldier. So I have a mini ball to pass around and share that. He was a surgeon in the Civil War and a soldier for the Confederate Army. And to write about him, I read some primary sources about what it was like for a Civil War soldier during that time. And let's see. So being an author has been a lot of fun. And I'm working on a sequel to continue the story. The book, it's a personal project. It's not a function of my job at Bridgewater College. And anyone can come in and see the John Whalen papers at Bridgewater College. We just ask people to please make an appointment to make sure that I'm there or somebody's there that can help them. But we're always happy to share those. I'd love to get them digitized someday too. So that is all that I have, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you. Yes?
So how exactly did she make snake oil?
Oh, okay. Thanks for asking. So the question is, how did Nancy Pullen make her snake oil? And Herbert Barbee told John Whalen that she would catch the snake in a noose, and then she would hang it up till by its head till it stopped wiggling. And I have an aside there that I forgot to tell, that a family friend said that her husband, before they were married and before he reformed and became a good family man, would catch snakes, and that they would indeed bite themselves if you didn't hang them up properly. So he hung them up on boards. But she would fry their oil out. Yeah, and then bottle it, and it would be a topical anti-inflammatory medicine. Yeah, John Whalen said that Nancy Pullen believed in her snake oil, and he said she believed in herself. I guess he was saying she had self-confidence, and he said that her neighbors believed in her snake oil. So there's a scene in the book where I reflect that some medical doctors are giving this fictional Nancy a hard time, and the townspeople come to her aid.
What substance is the snake oil? Is it the venom? It's not the venom?
I think it's, the question is, what substance is the snake oil? I think it's the fat. That the fat would have maybe the amino fatty acids. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Roughly what was the time frame from your finding the mention in Whalen's day books to when you decided to do a book? And was this like a 3 or 4 year project, and you must have had many branches and sequels to what you came across? So congratulations on doing it. But I was wondering how long that might take.
Oh, thanks. So the question is, how long did it take from reading about John Whalen's writings about these historic people to writing the book? And it went really quickly. I was really eager. I was really taken with Nancy's story. So that afternoon, I was telling my parents that I was so excited I'd read the neatest primary source, and that I would like to write about these people and maybe write a nonfiction article. But then I thought historical fiction might be fun too, and sticking with the primary sources. So it went very quickly. I wrote it kind of over the holidays, the winter holidays, and it didn't take that long. So yeah, it went pretty fast. This second book, it's taking longer, and I did a lot of looking at other primary and secondary sources too. They're cited in the back of the book. Many of the things are things that I talk about in the book, or things that I had long heard of or long thought of, like the Pennsylvania German folklore and some of the supernatural tales and things like that. So Yeah, it went quickly, just a few months, actually.
You mentioned Ms. McKay.
Yes.
In my words, a more refined person than some of the others. I was wondering if you happen to know if she was a descendant of Robert McKay, who was a business partner for Yost Pike, 1730s, 100,000 acre land grant, 40,000 McKay. But do you happen to know the line, her line?
Yeah, let me see what her father's name was.
Break
Yeah.
after if you want.
Yeah.
I caught my ear when you said,
Yeah, her father, he was heavily into business, and his name escapes me right now, but he was a civil engineer. He worked on the roads up there. So I'd say probably so, but I don't know for certain. We could look it up. She is, in the entire Barbie family, are very traceable on Family Search and on the Find a Grave website. And I think I forgot to repeat the question. The question was about Mary Jane Barbie's, who her ancestors were. Yes?
The thought that William Randolph Barbie would become a serious sculptor is really interesting to come from this little community. Where did he get his training to work with marble? Can you remind me of that?
Yeah. So the question was, where was William Randolph Barbie trained to do his marble carving? He went to art school for a little bit, and he was naturally talented, but he went to Italy and studied with some other American artists under the old masters there, and then returned to the USA. So he had classical art training, and his son Herbert Barbie, who's just a teen in this book, he became a marble sculptor as well.
Were they able to find some of his pieces? Did you say that one person stole them all? Are there pieces around?
Oh, yeah, thanks for asking. The comment was, and question was, were they able to find some of William Randolph Barbie's stolen art that was stolen by his assistant when he was in the Capitol building? And yes, some of it was found. Some of it was found years later. And I met some people who had some Barbie art, but I believe it was from the son Herbert Barbie. The large pieces are in some of the Washington art museums, like Fisher Girl, and I'm not sure where the Coquette is now.
I just observed you had the greatest number of items of show and tell of any speaker.
Oh, okay, yeah, thanks, yeah. So, yeah, the comment was that I have a lot of items for show and tell, but yeah, I thought this would be fun to do it material culture wise instead of a PowerPoint. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Okay. Well, I appreciate you all coming out and listening to the presentation about Rattlesnake Granny. It was a lot of fun to tell these people's stories and to imagine what their life would have been like, and to really enjoyed the research too with the primary and secondary sources.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I know Stephanie will be glad to answer questions individually. And she has the book for sale in the other room when we go back into the other room for refreshments.